Thank you, and thank you very much, Tony, for inviting me to talk about the genetics of personality this morning. I'm going to try to cover the following topics as listed in this slide. I'm always overly ambitious and usually have twice as many slides as I can cover in a 15-minute talk. So, if possible, I'm going to talk a little bit about the heritability of personality, show some studies in adults, in children, and end up with genome-wide association studies of normal personality variation. The papers I'm referring to you can find on the website of the Netherlands Twin Register. If you go to publications, all the PDFs are listed there. And over the coffee break, someone had this great suggestion. I'm looking for a postdoc with an interest in molecular and genetic epi-studies of alcohol use and addiction. I'm making a good start by basically going to skip this slide that summarizes the rationale for the classical twin study, comparing mono and dizygotic twins, their resemblance, as for example summarized into correlations. If we see that monozygotic twins resemble each other to a larger extent than dizygotic twins, the conclusion is that it's likely that genes are involved in the explanation of individual differences and why individual differences cluster in families. So as an example, this is a twin study of the 5 personality scales of the NEO, and very systematically you can see that for all the correlations in monozygotic twins, their resemblance is quite a bit larger than the resemblance in dizygotic twins. For openness, which is a trait which is a bit related to cognition, the resemblance is about twice as large, and for the other traits the resemblance is even a bit more than twice as large in monozygotic twins than in dizygotic twins, suggesting that there also might be a bit of genetic non-additivity explaining the heritability in these traits. So I'm going to present some studies that come from the Netherlands Twin Register. We do research in adults and in children. Adults basically volunteer to participate themselves. We also recruited them through city council registrations, and we're currently collecting the 9th wave of data in the adult population, which includes siblings, parents, and spouses of twins in addition to twins themselves, and we're following about 20,000 individuals. The young twins are registered as newborns. The oldest newborns are now young adults, and we're following longitudinally about 30,000 pairs, so that's about 60,000 children. This is a summary of the personality surveys that we collect in adult twins, and the entries in this slide that are graded a little bit, shaded a little bit in gray, were input for a large multivariate study of our longitudinal personality measures, and this slide basically summarizes the results. If we put in a wide variety of personality scales, then what we get out is a 3-factor structure. The first cluster is very much characterized by measures of neuroticism and anxiety, depression also. The second cluster, independent of the first one, is characterized by the 4 scales of Zuckerman's sensation-seeking scales. And the third cluster is characterized by aggression, hostility, and also, for example, extraversion. If we now look at the genetic architecture of those scales that go into these 3 factors, then we see some differences. The first cluster is the anger, extraversion, hostility cluster, and it is characterized by a contribution of genetic non-additive influences, or genetic dominance as it's sometimes called. So that the dark green is the unique environment, the lighter green is the genetic influences, genetic dominance, and the light blue is the additive genetic contribution, summarized in males and females, but as you can see there are no large sex differences in genetic architecture. The second cluster is the sensation-seeking scales, and those are characterized by a contribution of a bit of shared environment, which might reflect shared family environment. And then the third cluster is neuroticism, anxiety, and depression, and that's mainly additive genetic influences. So, of course, beyond the question of heritability, are individual differences explained by genotypic differences between individuals? There's a whole list of additional issues to address. Is the influence of genes and environment additive? Is there evidence for interaction? Or maybe even more importantly, to my mind, is there evidence for a correlation between genes and environment? Other issues include, is there evidence for assortative mating, which is a very important mechanism to change the genetic constitution of populations? Is there evidence for interactions with sex or age? And as a lot of this research is done in twins, is there actually twin-specific effects? So one example of an interaction between genes and environment, and this is between unmeasured genes and unmeasured environment and measured environment. For the disinhibition scale of the sensation-seeking questionnaires, and you see a couple of example items from this survey. It's obviously related to things in life, such as enjoying a drink. And we looked at the heritability of this inhibition trait as a function of whether or not people received a religious upbringing, and the results were rather striking. If you come from a non-religious upbringing, there is substantial heritability for this trait. However, if you come from a religious background, the heritability is basically zero. Moving to another important question, is there assortative mating for personality traits? We know there is significant assortment for human height, there is significant assortment for traits related to general intelligence and cognition. And if we look at personality traits, this is comparing several large samples. The upper part of the panel gives the total sample, which is nearly 2,000 couples, and then the lower two panels split this sample into somewhat younger and somewhat older people, the cutoff around age 50. So there is significant assortment for most personality traits. The highest correlation is for openness, which makes sense because we know there is high assortative mating for educational attainment, intelligence, cognition, etc. And that correlation is not a function of the age of people or how long they have been together. So this suggests that it is phenotypic assortment and not some sort of interaction process between couples. The other correlations are lower, basically in the vicinity of 0.10, the highest 0.13 for neuroticism. So looking at it at a bit more detail at the heritability of the personality scales that are covered by the NEO, and one additional reason why I'm bringing up this slide is that what you see in this slide is the correlation in monozygotic twins and then the correlation in dizygotic twins, including also sibling pairs who are not twins. And we tested whether the resemblance in dizygotic twins was any larger than the resemblance in siblings who are biological siblings who are not twins, and those correlations are similar. So that strongly suggests that it is not a twin-specific. 5 minutes. Okay. It's heritable. There is non-additive genetic variance for most traits. Moving to another personality trait, happiness. Also heritable, around 50%, and also consisting of additive and non-additive genetic influences. The relationship of personality and psychopathology. We looked at the relation of the neo and borderline disorder, which is characterized by impulsivity and very strongly correlated with the traits as measured by the neo, especially with neuroticism, and negatively with traits such as extraversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. If you take into account the heritability for the personality traits, there is no unique genetic variance left for the borderline personality feature trait on its own. Personality is related to addiction. This is using the discordant monozygotic twin design. And it is related to depression, anxiety, etc. Especially, of course, neuroticism. And the higher the number of clinical diagnoses a person receives, the higher the score on a neuroticism scale. Interestingly, all sorts of mental illness, MI traits are associated with well-being, but not in a perfect sense. There are people who report a relatively high sense of well-being while at the same time suffering from some sort of mental illness. And this slide describes the observed correlation between subjective happiness or well-being and different traits like withdrawn or anxious, or so withdrawn on the left-hand side and more externalizing traits on the right-hand side, mainly explained by a genetic relation association between the two concepts, but also by environmental influences. Similar results for males, but overall all associations a bit lower in males than they are in females. I'm going to skip this and end up with pointing to two papers that have come out looking for the genetic variants that might explain the heritability in normal personality. The first study came out in Molecular Psychiatry in 2008, and then a second meta-analysis was published also in Molecular Psychiatry last year. The first study was basically done in Sardinia with some replication cohorts for the top findings, and reported a significant genome-wide result for agreeableness, a polymorphism in the clock gene. The meta-analysis involved a very large number of samples, Sardinia, the Netherlands, Australian data, etc. Did not replicate the first finding for agreeableness, and reported two genome-wide significant findings, one for openness and one for conscientiousness. That's not to say that there aren't more genetic polymorphisms involved in these or the other traits. However, if we take the very strict threshold of a genome-wide significant findings, those two SNPs were the only ones to make it above that particular threshold. So the future, there are currently more mega and meta consortia starting up the genetic association studies of personality, and one current effort is to actually map the different instruments, for example those that measure neuroticism, all to a common scale through IRT modeling, so that a really, really big consortium, a really big data set for neuroticism can be constructed. There is interaction with the Psychiatric Genetics Consortium. For example, when we construct what is called polygenic scores for personality and relate those to indices of psychopathology. And I'm going to show you some of these results in the last minute. So as you saw, when you focus on genome-wide significant findings, the results are not very encouraging. In a very large meta-analysis, you find evidence for 2 SNPs that make the threshold. However, there is an alternative approach, and we took this alternative approach looking at major depressive disorder and the 5 scales of the neo-personality instrument. There have been meta-analyses on the phenotypic level showing that especially neuroticism and also conscientiousness are related to major depressive disorder. And we took the approach that was suggested by Sean Purcell in Nature in 2009. You take not just the one SNP that is genome-wide significant, but you take a whole list of SNPs that, according to some cutoff, like all SNPs with a p-value of 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3, there will be lots of false positives among those SNPs, but there also will be some true findings. So you take 100,000 SNPs for an individual, you construct a genetic score, a genetic polygenic score for, say, neuroticism, and then you test whether this score predicts depression. So that's illustrated in this slide. Here we have 4 SNPs. They have different levels of statistical significance. These are all assessed on an individual level in the participants of a study. And for example, the first subject in this study has AA on the first locus, AG on the second, etc. And we construct his or her genetic risk score by simply summing over all these loci. We then get one measure, the genetic risk score, and we can use this as a prediction for example, a major depressive disorder. And that was done based on the results of the personality study that I just showed you. We took the SNPs from the meta-analysis, then tried to predict major depressive disorder, which was significant for neuroticism and also for conscientiousness, although only at some levels of p-values and not all. Thank you. And thanks to the twins.